A loving mother with a selfless spirit.
I remember her laughter. You could hear Mother laughing from 2 rooms away.
She was really representative of the goodness in people. She loved her community. They loved her.
Is stabbed to death in a horrifying attack.
It was gruesome crime scene. There was a lot of blood.
The perpetrator left the victim with a 2-pronged serving fork sticking out of her throat.
The amount of devastation led us to believe that it definitely was a crime of passion.
Suspicion falls on those closest to her.
He was the husband that last saw her alive. He didn't really show any signs of grieving.
He failed the polygraph.
My first thought was that it was a domestic assault.
Her son had an argument with his mother that morning.
A neighbor had seen a teenager running away from the home that day.
Months go by without an arrest.
We kept wondering, why is it so hard to capture a murderer in this small town?
Then, just as the case is in danger of going cold, police uncover a dire warning
The note threatened more violence.
that leads to a deranged killer no one could have predicted.
Wow, we didn't see that coming.
Shenandoah, Iowa is a close-knit farming community home to just 5,500 people.
Shenandoah is your typical small town. It's just beautiful. The corn surrounding the towns. Everybody knows one another. You just are almost shocked at how nice folks are.
It's a small, peaceful community. People know their neighbors, take care of each other. You don't have a lot of violent crime of any nature.
The peace is shattered on September 6, 1988, when police get a disturbing call from local pastor Robert Borton at 3:40 p.m. He tells police his wife of 19 years, Cindy, is dead.
He found her body in the kitchen, lying in a pool of her own blood. He called authorities, who arrived immediately and kept him outside of the house.
It was gruesome crime scene. We found a female on the kitchen floor. There was a lot of blood everywhere. This person had been stabbed many, many times.
The perpetrator left the victim lying on her back in a pool of blood with a 2-pronged serving fork sticking out of her throat. That image stayed with me because it was remarkable in its gruesomeness. There were 4 instruments that appeared to come from her kitchen that were weapons of convenience for the killer.
There were 2 forks, a large 2-pronged fork, a 4-pronged fork, as well as 2 knives. There was a struggle. There were some cuts on her hand where she had fought the person and she had tried to get away from the person. The phone had been ripped off of the wall, and it was obvious that a lot of activity went on while Cindy was being killed.
Detectives observe that the pool of blood is not yet dry, meaning the murder likely happened in the late morning or early afternoon.
In addition to the blood in the kitchen, there were also some blood stains found in the bathroom.
It was obvious that the person had cleaned up in the bathroom because there wasn't any visible pools of blood, just blood that looked like it had been washed off of hands or clothing. We did not have the benefit of DNA testing back in the 80s. Blood would have been collected still because you can type the blood, and that was what was one thing that we'd be looking at. And of course, fingerprints, obviously, throughout the crime scene.
There was no forced entry. We were 99% sure that she knew who the perpetrator was. My first thought was that it was a family assault.
The amount of devastation that was there at the crime scene led us to believe that it definitely was a crime of passion.
Detectives had to speak with Cindy's husband, Robert, but are beaten to it by a new arrival at the scene, the couple's 18-year-old son.
I seen an ambulance parked in front of my house, and my father was leaning against the front of my mother's car crying, and I just knew deep down inside me that my world was never going to be the same. I dropped my backpack there in the middle of the yard and went running up to my father, and he then informed me that Mama was gone.
39-year-old Cynthia Borton was a born and bred Iowa girl. She and her brother were raised by loving parents just outside Des Moines.
My mother and my uncle would always tell me about the adventures that they had around the farm. Life was good for them. Everybody had to laugh, according to Mama. I remember her laughter. You could hear Mother laughing from 2 rooms away. You would have to rush in there to find out what it was that was so funny that made Mama laugh.
As a teen, Cindy worked at a local restaurant and soon after would meet her future husband.
My father wound up coming in there and doing the whole phone number exchange thing, and then they started going out, and one thing led to another.
The couple married in 1969. When the family moved to Shenandoah, Cindy had her hands full.
Mama just kind of assumed the role of the pastor's wife. She also worked at a donut place there. Mama always did what she had to do to take care of the family. I was her everything. I was very much a mama's boy. My mother was love personified.
Cindy's warm heart also extended to those outside the family.
Mama always had an open door policy for all of my friends. They always knew that my mother was there to be a second mother to them, somebody that they could talk to, that she never passed judgment on anybody. She was also very good with giving out the hugs. Mama was always there to give you a hand back up if life knocked you down.
Cindy loved her community. They loved her. She was really representative of a small town in Iowa, the goodness in people.
Cindy's death leaves many in the community wondering who could have killed her. Investigators have an idea on where to start.
Back in that time, about 85% of all homicides in the state of Iowa were committed by someone close to the victim. A husband is always a major suspect at the time we see a homicide like this, especially one with so much rage involved.
Robert was interviewed and gave the following timeline. He had gone to work that morning at Select Motors, where he was a part-time worker because preaching to a small rural congregation is not lucrative employment. Robert returned home at noon, as was his habit. His wife served him spaghetti for lunch, and at 1 o'clock he returned to work. Cindy worked at a local bakery. Her shift was to start at 2 o'clock that day. When she didn't show up for work, her employer became concerned and called Robert. He indicated that he thought perhaps she had simply taken a nap and overslept. Approximately an hour or so later, when she still had not shown up for work, he got the second phone call from his wife's employer. He went home at about 3:30 in the afternoon to discover Cindy dead on the kitchen floor.
What Robert says he did next raises a red flag to detectives.
After finding his wife and then calling to get some help, he took the dog out instead of, being there for his wife or trying to do something for his wife. He said he wanted it to be tied up so that the ambulance people wouldn't have to deal with his pets. That was very unusual and very strange.
Then, Robert offers up a theory investigators find completely ludicrous.
Bob was saying that his wife could have just tripped and fell onto this fork. That was totally not plausible. It didn't make any sense whatsoever. It's just, I can't imagine anyone, ending up in a situation, and certainly not with the amount of blood that was found there at the scene, too.
He thought that it was an accident. And that really raised eyebrows. How could you possibly think that someone had just fallen? You just think, well, this is someone who snapped.
Bob Borton was our prime suspect immediately after the death of Cynthia Borton because, first of all, he was the last person to see her alive, and then he also was the one that found her.
Coming up, suspicion swells around Cindy's husband.
His work clothing was laundered before investigators had an opportunity to examine it for blood spatter.
What does Robert Borton have to hide?
The only thing I want him to say is, I did it.
While police dig for evidence against their top suspect, a threatening clue sends shockwaves through the town.
There were a great many different and wild rumors, leaving notes at the scene. Cynthia Borton ain't nothing compared to what's coming. And hints such as the NS Night Stalker.
This story just got even more crazy and more sensational and more scary.
Police in Shenandoah, Iowa are investigating the gruesome murder of 39-year-old Cynthia Borton. Her husband Robert's erratic behavior is putting him in detective spotlight.
Robert commented that his wife had simply fallen on a serving fork and died an accidental death. These comments were certainly unusual and suspicious.
Police bring Robert to the station for a formal interview.
Bob did have a very strange personality and strange mannerisms about him when he was interviewed. He didn't really show any signs of grieving. You would have expected that a man having just lost his wife would be very emotional at the time he was being interviewed, but we didn't see that with Bob Borton. He was very matter-of-fact. He was just so casual in talking even about finding his wife. He acted like that was just everyday thing. It's just like talking about, well, what's the weather going to be like today?
Detectives question Robert about his relationship with Cindy.
He told us about, having arguments once in a while. He went in kind of a defensive mode about the questioning. When they're reacting like that, it does put up a red flag like that.
Investigators try to provoke a telling reaction out of Robert.
He didn't get upset when I accused him of being the one responsible for his wife's death. He didn't show sadness. He didn't cry.
His stoic but unemotional denials only increased their suspicions.
At that point in time, Bob Borton couldn't be held at all. We had no evidence to show that he was responsible. We had no information other than his matter-of-fact attitude.
Robert provides fingerprint samples, but with nothing concrete linking him to the murder, investigators must let him go.
This, frankly, was frustrating to some of the investigators involved in the case.
Cindy's body has been sent to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy. While police wait to learn a specific time of death, they look to verify Robert's whereabouts.
His boss alibied him for the time that he said that he was at work that day.
Knowing it's still possible Robert killed Cindy when he went home on his lunch break at noon, what his boss tells detectives next rings alarm bells.
He changed his clothes when he went back to work.
Before the body was found, he dropped off his work clothing. It was laundered before investigators had an opportunity to examine it for blood spatter.
Had this all been part of Robert's well-executed plan?
There isn't always transfer of blood from a victim to a perpetrator, even in an extremely bloody killing such as this one. But of course, the likelihood that there would be made it important to examine the clothing, and that was impossible because those clothes, as it happened, were very quickly laundered.
That certainly was a little detail that made us think that it was him.
Investigators conducted a great deal of background interviews with neighbors, friends, co-workers.
We did look into the relationship between Robert and Cynthia Borton to see if it was a good marriage. And we did determine that they did have some problems. Everything wasn't roses and everything wasn't as you might think.
There was quarreling in the house. We thought maybe he had a lot of rage that he wanted to get rid of, and he was taking it out on Cindy. But we had never been called there for family disturbance or anything.
Needing to verify information about Cindy and Robert's relationship, detectives seek out their son, John, but the teen has vanished.
On the day she passed, all I did was shut down. My best friend, Jim, and his mother and father came driving by in their car and attempted to speak with me. I was not in the mood to talk. And then I just kept on walking.
When John arrives back home that night, detectives are there waiting.
They wanted everything that I could tell them while it was still all fresh in my mind. My father and I were still of the impression that it could have been accidental.
When asked about his parents' relationship, John admits there were problems.
There was some disagreements and a little bit of an argument, and then they realized that could I actually find anybody better for me? The answer they came up with was no, so it's like we were happy one time. We need to figure this out, get it worked out. That whole part of the wedding vows of till death do us part, they both took that very seriously.
John is too upset to say much more. Police end their conversation, but plan to talk with him again when he's less distraught. Officers are then dispatched to canvass the area around the Borton home.
They talk to the neighbors and try to find out if there's anybody who witnessed anything suspicious.
A neighbor had seen a teenager running away from the home that day, actually in the afternoon.
The neighbor's description of the teen sounds strikingly familiar.
John Borton, Cynthia's son, fit the description of the person that had run away from the house.
Had John come home early from school to murder his own mother?
It was a fascinating story. It was a mystery. He seemed like your typical teenager.
Bob Borton and also John Borton were the main and only suspects.
That in itself was the shocking part.
Detectives investigating the vicious slaying of Cynthia Borton have two prime suspects. Her husband, Robert, who found her dead, and now their 18-year-old son, who matches the description of a teen seen fleeing the area around the time of the murder.
John Borton, even though he was scheduled to have been at school that day, might have come home early. So John Borton early on was a person that we wanted to talk with and get more details about where he was on that day.
The day after the murder, John is brought to the police department for another interview.
They started with the questions about the home life and everything else. I told them my mother was literally my whole world.
When detectives asked John about the last time he saw his mother, he makes a startling admission.
John indicated in his interview that he had had an argument with his mother that morning. That, of course, was interesting and relevant information.
Mother and I did disagree because I was not in the mood to go to school that day. My last words to my mother that day were a bit harsh. I have zero pride or pleasure that I can take from that particular morning.
John maintains he was at school the entire day, but he didn't have any classes between noon and 3 p.m., the approximate window of time when detectives suspect Cindy was murdered.
The whole tone of the investigation changed. They were considering me personally to be a suspect. Who on earth could think that I would do this to my mother?
In a household with 3 people, the 2 surviving occupants would always be interviewed and looked at to see if they had an alibi.
We tried to determine with anybody at the school to make sure that they saw him there and to make sure that he was, in fact, in school, not just that he was supposed to be in school, but that people actually did see him there during that day.
Investigators took aside two of John's friends, Jim and Jackson, to find out if there was anything that might cause them to be concerned about John as a suspect.
The teens can't confirm John was at school the entire day, but they're adamant he's not the killer.
One of the first people to console him about his mother's death was Jim Bettis.
Friends of John Borton said Cynthia Borton's murder had been true devastation for John.
I heard some of my teachers kind of speaking in kind of a low, hushed tone thing, that the detectives had come by and questioned them as to whether or not I was actually at school. Could anybody verify that I was there all day like I was supposed to be? Eventually, they were able to reconstruct my alibi for the entire afternoon.
Detectives talked with his teachers who verified that he had spent that full day at school.
Cynthia's son John is ruled out as a suspect. 3 days later, the autopsy report comes in and police look for any insight into what exactly happened that gruesome day.
Cindy suffered a horrifying death. The medical examiner found that Cindy had been stabbed 29 times with at least 4 different instruments, 2 knives and 2 serving forks. In addition to stab wounds that directly led to her death by puncturing vital organs, she had defensive wounds on her hands and forearms. She struggled with her assailant. She had to know that she was dying at the hands of her killer.
The autopsy report also provides a detail crucial to the investigation.
Based upon his finding of a stomach full of completely undigested spaghetti, the medical examiner estimated the time of death as 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Cindy and Robert had shared a meal of spaghetti between 12 and 1 o'clock. Robert placed himself in that home alone in his wife's company at the estimated time of death.
It really made Bob Borton our prime suspect. He was the husband that last saw her alive. He was the husband that was the first to find her dead on the kitchen floor. He and his wife had had difficulties throughout their marriage, had had problems.
Investigators decided that it was important to keep working on Robert. He was really their only feasible suspect.
Based on the findings of the autopsy report and mounting circumstantial evidence, Robert is called back in for another interview.
One of our agents was very aggressive in interrogating Bob Borton about his wife's murder and accusing him of being the murderer. And Bob, again, sat very calm and still and was not irate about being accused of having taken his wife's life. The investigators decided to give me a call and ask me to conduct a polygraph examination of Bob Borton and do that right away before he had a chance to think twice about it. The relevant questions that I asked Bob Borton is, were you responsible for your wife's death? Did you cause your wife's death? Did you stab your wife? He was just very humdrum, very relaxed, and very, well, I guess, you'll have to do what you have to do because I didn't do it.
The polygraph results tell a different story.
He failed the polygraph. The results were that he was lying and that he was culpable in this crime. So investigators were, in fact, increasingly convinced that Robert had killed his wife.
After the gruesome murder of Cindy Borton, her husband Robert, the prime suspect in her murder, has just failed a polygraph.
When I did see those results, the thing that next happens is for me to go in and interrogate him and try to determine why he was being deceptive. I needed to try to get a confession from him. When I confronted him with the results of the polygraph examination, he didn't shake his head no that he didn't do it. He didn't try to respond to me in any way, shape, or form. He just basically sat in a chair and didn't move. The only thing I want him to say is, I did it. And so we were very aggressive in interrogating Bob Borton about his wife's murder.
Robert Borton never wavered in his denial that he was responsible for this.
Robert's behavior under questioning becomes even more unusual.
He did, in fact, fall asleep in the chair. The only time that anybody has ever fallen asleep in the middle of one of my interrogations. Bob Borton's reactions were not what we would have considered to be normal.
Despite failing the polygraph, the evidence against Robert is purely circumstantial, so detectives have no choice but to let him go.
At that point in time, we're thinking we must have missed something. There must be something more involved that we're not aware of.
The lack of an arrest unsettles the town further.
The people of the community really are concerned when there is an immediate suspect why that person's not apprehended and taken to jail. But we need more information. We need more evidence.
The members of the community were increasingly convinced that Robert had killed his wife. They expressed those concerns. They brought a great deal of pressure on the chief of police.
The public was just as anxious to get it solved as the police was. We wanted to get this case cleared up so gossip and things would die down after, of course, this happened. He wasn't preaching for a while, and then people just quit attending.
There was a real change my father noticed. People who were open and friendly with him, all of a sudden, they quite often would go as far as to cross the street so that they would not have to walk near him, would not have to speak with him. I did my best to at least attempt to continue my life as well as I could.
Laying Cindy to rest is tough on the young teen.
The only time I can remember my mother having a brand new dress was the one bought for her to bury her in. It's the only brand new dress I ever recall her having.
2 months after Cindy's murder, Robert and John leave Shenandoah.
It was unbearable for my father to continue to live there. People who he thought had been friends before had shut him out.
He moved to a town 3 hours away, and we watched his movements, where he went, who he was meeting with.
The police were really struggling because they had nothing. They had no one else.
2.5 months later, when the state crime lab sends investigators the results of the fingerprint analysis, they hope it'll be the crucial evidence for which they've been waiting.
Robert's fingerprints were not found on any of the murder weapons or the phone. This, frankly, was frustrating to some of the investigators involved in the case. It was solid evidence that someone other than Robert Borton was very possibly the guilty party in this murder.
The news is a huge blow to the investigation.
It's concerning whenever cases are not immediately solvable, and as time passes, the prospects for solving them become smaller and smaller.
We just waited for authorities to make an arrest. And when they didn't make an arrest in the months that were going by, that's when we started to realize this is somebody that they don't know who it is.
3 months after the murder, as detectives redouble their efforts to unearth new suspects, another crime in Shenandoah comes to their attention.
In the weeks preceding and following the murder of Cindy Borton, there were arsons in the town of Shenandoah. Even though arson is a different crime than murder, it's a violent crime. And when one has a series of violent crimes, in this case, the arsons and the murder, all occurring within a matter of weeks, it would be only normal to at least examine the possibility of a connection between the two.
On November 30th, another arson occurs, and a clue found at the scene leaves investigators stunned.
The arsonist left a note referring to the 2 prior arsons and Cynthia Borton, and in fact threatened more violence in that community, saying that the arsons and Cindy Borton ain't nothing compared to what's coming.
Oh my gosh, this story just got even more crazy and more sensational and more scary.
Detectives hunting the killer of Cindy Borton have just received a mysterious clue linking her murder to a series of arson fires across town.
There was a note that was, in fact, very intriguing, and the note referred to all three arsons and Cindy Borton, obviously raising the possibility that the perpetrator of the arsons was also the perpetrator of the Cindy Borton murder. The note in question was signed the Night Stalker, NS, which copied the name of a highly publicized murderer in California.
At the time, the Night Stalker had already been arrested, so this was clearly a copycat killer.
It was rather apparent that the perpetrator was someone who used that name out of convenience and imitation.
He was calling himself the Night Stalker. Wow, he's just crazy.
There were a great many different and wild rumors, leaving notes at the scene and hints such as the NS Night Stalker were quite possibly a cry for attention. This would have to be investigated. The note was examined for fingerprints, and indeed some latent fingerprint ridge detail was found on the note.
The prints are sent to the crime lab for analysis.
It was important not only to continue investigating the murder, but also to investigate the arsons for purpose of developing a suspect on the murder. There had been 3 arsons in the community. One had been at the Broad Street School. The letters NS were found slashed on a bridge near the Broad Street School fire.
There was another fire set in a school teacher's pickup, and there was a note, "The Night Stalker strikes again."
This case was a genuine whodunit. Even though we had the Night Stalker note, investigators didn't know who had authored it or who had committed the arsons.
I never really would have expected this case to go where it went. You know, it wasn't something that we expected from the beginning at all.
Several days later, detectives get the fingerprint results from the note, and they don't match back to anyone in their database.
There was, in fact, a killer at loose in their community.
As every week went by, and then the months, we kept wondering, why is it so hard to capture a murderer in this small town who committed a murder in such a shocking, unbelievable manner?
On January 31st, 1989, police finally get a break in the case.
5 months after this murder, a young man named Jackson, a high school student, came into the police department and informed authorities that the previous day he'd had a visit from a friend, another teenager, and that in the course of their afternoon visiting with each other, this friend had told him that he had some very shocking information and something that was bothering him. More specifically, that he had murdered Cindy Borton. This information was a shock that shed an entirely new light on the investigation.
When Jackson came into the Shenandoah Police Department, yes, that definitely was a big break. His friend had told him things that happened at the crime scene that only the killer would know.
Jackson's friend described the murder that he had committed and even went so far as to draw a small diagram indicating exactly where the body had been left in the house. Jackson shared this drawing as well with the authorities, which was important and surprising because it appeared quite accurate.
He told Jackson, "I'm going to show you where the knife is." And he did that. And that's when Jackson realized, oh, he's really done this. And later that day, even though he was sworn to secrecy, he thought about his own mom and how the killer had been a guest in their house, and he thought, wow, that could have been my mom. So it wasn't hard for him to go to the police after that.
At this point, investigators were aware that Jackson had indeed very likely spoken to Cindy Borton's murderer.
Jackson said that James Bettis was the one responsible for killing Cynthia Borton.
Jim Bettis was a close friend of John Borton. They were classmates until Jimmy dropped out of high school. He was close enough to John and interacted with the Bortons so much that Cindy was very involved in Jim's life. He even thought of Cindy as a second mother to him. She tried to help him, tried to persuade him to return to school and get an education. She was a very good friend and mother figure to the young man. Jim was certainly not a suspect up to this point, but his statement to Jackson rang true.
It was amazement at that point in time because we talked to James Bettis previously. James Bettis became the prime suspect because of his admissions to his friend, but we need more corroboration. Jim was taken to the Shenandoah Police Department and he was interviewed. Jim did confess to the arsons, as a matter of fact, but denied ever having said anything to Jackson about Cynthia Borton's murder or having any involvement in Cynthia Borton's murder.
Jim agrees to have his fingerprints collected. He's also willing to undergo a polygraph.
During the polygraph examination, the questions I was asked were, was he involved in the death of Cynthia Borton, specifically whether he was the one that committed the crime.
Jimmy Bettis insisted throughout that he did not kill Cindy Borton.
When I quantified the polygraph examinations and I actually gave a numerical figure to each of his reactions, if they're over a -6, that strongly indicates to us that he's deceptive. James Bettis came up a -23. So there is absolutely no question he was the one involved in Cynthia Borton's murder.
It was a big shock, and it really left us, and I think everyone, scratching their head. Wow, we didn't see that coming.
After the horrific slaying of Cindy Borton, detectives get their biggest break when her son's friend fails a polygraph.
Jim Bettis's polygraph, according to Agent McCleary, showed deception on his denial that he had murdered Cindy Borton.
It was very unusual that all of a sudden this person would become a suspect who was a teenager, and also he was good friends with Cynthia's son. And he had been in Cynthia's house many occasions.
Investigators confront Jim with the results.
The very next thing I said was, we all know exactly what happened on September 6th. You were the one responsible for having killed Cynthia Borton. There's no question in anybody's mind now. And he came out and said, I did it. Okay, I did it.
Jim Bettis had not been on our radar at all. We never dreamed that he might be capable of something like this.
James Bettis told me that on September 6th of 1988, he was walking around town, he was thinking about his father. He was thinking about how he hated his father.
His dad was always telling him that he was no good, he wasn't going to amount to anything. It was terrible. He hated his dad.
He needed to be able to get that rage out. And how he was going to do that was by seeing if he could actually kill.
His statement was that he wanted to kill his father, but that he knew he couldn't get that job done, and so he killed someone who was far more vulnerable, and that Cynthia Borton was a victim of convenience.
Police believe Jim showed up at the Borton household, just narrowly missing Robert, who had gone back to work after lunch.
Cynthia Borton answered the door and allowed him to come in because he had been there many times previously.
During his confession, Jimmy Bettis indicated that he had asked Cindy for a glass of water, which led her to walk into the kitchen. He followed her there, approaching her from behind, and grabbing a knife, immediately slashed her throat from behind. He stated he had used a pocket knife of his own in addition to Cynthia Borton's kitchen utensils. And that after the crime, he took his pocket knife, stained with Cindy Borton's blood, and threw it under a bridge. This was important information. It would corroborate his confession if in fact that knife could be found and if in fact it had Cindy Borton's blood on it. Investigators scoured the area, found the knife where Jimmy Bettis described that they would find it, and when it was tested at the laboratory, indeed it had not only Cindy Borton's blood, but also Jimmy Bettis's fingerprint.
On February 2nd, 1989, detectives charge 18-year-old Jim Bettis with first-degree murder and 3 counts of arson.
The investigator told me that Jim had been arrested and he had confessed repeatedly. My first response was, no, he did not do this. He was my best friend. He was the first person that I trusted that was not an actual blood relative. It occurred to me that in at least some way I am responsible for this because I am the reason that he came into my house, that he was accepted into my house, and my mother is gone. There is nothing I can do to get her back.
At trial, Jim is convicted, and on November 13th, 1989, he's sentenced to life in prison.
Jimmy Bettis was a very troubled and angry and rage-filled young man. Had this crime not been solved when it was, there's every reason to be concerned that there would have been more fires, if not more murders.
My best friend committed this heinous crime of murder against somebody who trusted him, supported him, and cared for him. He frequently told me that we were brothers forever, and I honestly felt the same thing for him. And then for him to turn around and do such a horrific action, there is a bit of relief knowing that he will never be out again for the rest of his life.
A pair of serial killers roamed the Midwest, preying on adults and children alike. Always a step behind, agents had no choice but to follow the trail of bodies. As the crime spree raged out of control, pressure mounted to stop these killers.
They swept through 6 states like a plague, thrill killers acting without rhyme or reason. They targeted adults and young girls, kidnapping, murdering, then moving on to kill again. And in their rampage, they left plenty of clues. But moving targets are the hardest to hit. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. The hunt was on for these killers with a knack for eluding authorities. We hoped a nationwide dragnet would bring them to justice.
In Kenosha, Wisconsin, a community close to the Illinois border, single mother Juanita Wheat arrived home with her 9-year-old daughter Vernita and their new friend Robert Knight. It was getting late on the evening of May 29, 1984, when they returned from a day of fun at a local carnival. Robert told Juanita that he had a belated Mother's Day present for her at his place just a few blocks away. He asked if Vernita could help him carry it back. He promised it would only take an hour. Reluctant at first, Juanita gave in to her daughter's excited pleas.
All right. Be goodbye, baby. All right, we'll be right back. Take care, Mom. I will.
As it approached midnight, Robert and Vernita had not yet returned. Juanita was anxious about leaving her apartment to look for her daughter. If Vernita arrived to an empty home, the young girl might panic. But the worry became too great. Juanita decided to go and find her daughter. She went to the address Robert had given her. When she arrived, her panic melted into horror. The building that Robert Knight claimed was his home was abandoned. Not knowing where else to turn, Juanita went to her friend Ellen Reeves for help. Concerned for the safety of her friend's daughter, Ellen insisted it was time to contact the police. Juanita told the officer that her happy, outgoing daughter would not have run away. The officer's focus turned to Robert Knight. Juanita said she had met Robert a month earlier. He introduced himself while riding through the neighborhood on his bike. They had become friendly, and Robert had become fond of young Vernita. The police didn't have a Robert Knight on record. The officer asked Juanita to check mugshots for anyone who might look like him. Juanita scanned 2 books of photos. Finally, she pointed to a picture of a man she was sure was Robert Knight. Officers determined that the person Juanita had identified as Robert Knight was really named Alton Coleman. Investigators called the FBI. Special Agent Verdina Passanelli of the FBI's Kenosha, Wisconsin office was assigned the investigation.
But the FBI always gets involved when children of tender years disappear under unusual circumstances, and this was clearly one of those.
Investigators wasted no time in obtaining a search warrant for Coleman's last known address, his grandmother's house in Waukegan, Illinois, just a few miles across the state line from where the Wheats lived. A young woman answered the door. When questioned by the detective, she identified herself as Deborah Brown, Coleman's girlfriend. At first, Brown was reluctant to answer any questions about Coleman or his whereabouts. She said she had been living at the residence for a year, providing home care for Coleman's nearly blind grandmother. The investigators persisted. They finally convinced Deborah to cooperate.
Do you know his whereabouts right now?
She told them that Coleman had been gone all night, but came home alone at about 8 o'clock in the morning. He had come by to change into a suit for a court appearance later that morning. Coleman had been charged with raping a 14-year-old girl at knife point. Brown also admitted that Coleman had told her he had done something really bad the night before, but he did not explain what. Investigators waited at the house for Coleman's return while other officers canvassed the area.
Okay, do you know if did he drive?
He was nowhere to be found. The FBI joined forces with local investigators. Detectives from Kenosha and nearby Waukegan, Illinois, already knew Coleman's reputation. He was a violent criminal with a disturbing past.
As I learned about Coleman, I realized he was extremely dangerous because the Waukegan Police Department had an extensive arrest record on him. He had been arrested almost 10 years previously for the rape of a 40-year-old woman And he had a number of other arrests, mostly for assault, for molestation, rape of a child. And as you looked at these cases and you listened to the detectives who were familiar with him, you saw a picture of an increasingly violent person.
The task force enlisted every available officer and agent to help in the search for Coleman and Vernita.
Our strategy that night was to find Alton Coleman. We sat down then at the police department and assembled everything we knew. We came up with information that he a lot of times rode the train, he took taxis because he didn't have a car. What happened then is we split up into teams and went out and started interviewing people.
On the streets, investigators talked with drivers at various taxi stands. Everyone was familiar with Alton Coleman. The cabbies agreed that if they saw him, they would notify the police. The task force offered a $5,000 reward for information leading to Coleman's arrest. The promise of a reward caught people's attention, but didn't draw out any useful leads as quickly as the investigators hoped. Investigators feared that time may be running out for Vernita Wheat. On May 31st, 2 days into the investigation, a cab driver in Waukegan who knew Coleman from the neighborhood called in to report he was picking Coleman up. A squad car conducting surveillance in the area responded. Coleman was dropped off at his sister Terry's place. He saw the approaching officer and took off. He disappeared into the neighborhood he knew so well. The investigation was only 2 days old, and their suspect was within their grasp. Investigators speculated Coleman was probably hiding out in the abandoned warehouses that ran along Lake Michigan. Hoping that Coleman might respond to his sister's voice, the detectives summoned her.
Waukegan Police, ma'am, please open up. I'm Detective Hanson from Luther, Antoine.
Though she was Coleman's own flesh and blood, she was also a mother of a young girl. The agents convinced her to help. Talking to her brother through a bullhorn, she pleaded with him to turn himself in.
Alton, you need to come on out and give yourself up.
Meanwhile, officers and agents fanned out and searched the area. But even in such a confined space, finding Coleman would not be easy. Lieutenant Mark Hansen of the Waukegan Police Department was the lead investigator for the task force.
This area has a lot of abandoned buildings, a lot of abandoned apartment complexes. It's heavily brushed. It was at nighttime, easy to escape in there and not be seen again. This was 1984. We didn't have helicopters with searchlights. We didn't have infrared. We didn't have the resources to fully encircle an area of that size.
The search continued through the night. But after 8 hours, it seemed their suspect and their best chance of finding 9-year-old Vernita had slipped through their fingers. Desperate to generate leads, investigators saturated the local media with details surrounding the abduction. TV and newspapers ran photographs of Vernita Wheat, asking anyone with any information to contact the task force. The news spread quickly. Investigators were flooded with sightings of Coleman from the public. Most were dead ends. But one cab driver who saw Vernita's picture on the news contacted the task force. He remembered picking up Coleman and the little girl on the night of her disappearance. He had assumed they were father and daughter. The cab driver dropped them off around midnight near a scrapyard in the industrial section of Waukegan.
That one particular night, where did you take him to?
Investigators approached the night manager at the scrapyard.
Evening. Hi. Sir, I'm Detective Hanson, Waukegan Police. Here's my card. This is Agent Showers.
He told them that he had in fact seen a man with a young girl on the night in question. He recalled that close to midnight, the two had walked hand in hand through the side gate. He couldn't really see the man's face, but he did notice that the man had an unusual rolling gait to his walk, a feature that acquaintances of Coleman had described. The night manager identified the little girl as Vernita Wheat. The sighting was enough to allow the FBI to issue a federal warrant for Alton Coleman. He had taken Vernita across state lines. It was also the last time anyone saw Vernita Wheat alive. The task force responded with another massive search.
We had about 150 FBI agents and detectives from both Kenosha and Waukegan. We did a methodical search where Coleman was last seen with Vernita. This included using dogs going through the junkyard, house-to-house and abandoned building searches, all in this downtown area, and we found nothing.
Investigators knew she was alive at midnight on the evening she disappeared. They also knew that Coleman was alone the next morning at 8 a.m. as he prepared for his court appearance.
So total there's...
The question was, what happened to Vernita during that 8-hour gap?
Profile from FBI headquarters in Coleman.
FBI Special Agent Jeff Showers was on the task force. He struggled to fit the pieces together.
How far is he going to travel with this girl? The girl may not even be in Waukegan. She may be in another town. But we knew that the longer that we waited, it was getting dimmer and dimmer.
Coleman and Vernita seemed to have vanished. On the night of June 19th, 3 weeks after Vernita's disappearance, investigators received a call from a man in Waukegan who was looking through an abandoned building for scrap metal to sell. On the second floor of the wrecked apartments, he made a horrifying discovery. The body of a child lay on the bathroom floor. Alton Coleman, the FBI's prime suspect in the abduction of 9-year-old Vernita Wheat from her home in Kenosha, Wisconsin, remained at large. As the hunt for Coleman intensified, a man scouring for scrap metal in an abandoned building in Waukegan, Illinois, came across the lifeless body of a young girl. The forensic team arrived at the building. Beneath a blanket, wrapped in a man's corduroy jacket, the investigators found the young girl. Her hands, feet, and neck were bound by a television cable. She was too badly decomposed to confirm her identity. But Special Agent Jeff Showers believed they had found the body of Vernita Wheat.
The clothing matched the description that we had from the mother. She was still wearing the barrettes in her hair that matched from what her mother had described her as being last known to be wearing. She was wearing the green nylon jacket. In the pocket of the jacket were carnival tickets, and we knew from an interview of her mother that the night in question, Alton Coleman had taken Vernita Wheat to a carnival.
While the investigators suspected the body was Vernita Wheat, it was up to the forensic team to prove that the remains were hers. They also needed to find evidence that could conclusively point to the killer. Starting from the location of the body, they worked their way out in concentric circles, collecting anything that looked like it could be used as evidence. Investigators swabbed walls and door frames in an effort to find prints. Figuring whoever moved the body into the room had to come in contact with the door, they removed it from its hinges and sent it to the FBI labs in Washington, D.C. Under the lab's microscopes, FBI examiners discerned a thumbprint on the door. In comparison to samples they had on file were conclusive. The thumbprint came from Alton Coleman. Examiners also compared prints taken from the little girl's hands to those lifted from Vernita Wheat's school books that had been retrieved from her home. That comparison was also positive. The search for Vernita was over. Investigators now had enough evidence to issue another warrant for Alton Coleman. This time, it was for the murder of Vernita Wheat.
We knew then that Alton Coleman was responsible for the death of this child. And now we've got not only a kidnapper, but we also have someone who's committed murder.
While at the autopsy to determine Vernita Wheat's exact cause of death, a television news broadcast caught the attention of Agent Showers and Detective Hansen.
The first news that a little girl had been found murdered in Gary, Indiana. Agent Showers, I think, immediately thought that there could be some connection to Coleman.
The report also mentioned something that investigators found disturbing. There were two killers, and the second suspect was described as being a black female. Investigators immediately suspected Coleman's girlfriend, Deborah Brown, who had not been seen in weeks. If investigators were right, Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown had traveled 90 miles from their hometown neighborhood. They were on the move, and they were leaving bodies along their way. At the hospital in Gary, Indiana, local police officers questioned 9-year-old Mary James about the afternoon of June 16th. Mary told the officers that she and 7-year-old Janice Clay were walking to the store when they were approached by a man and a woman on bikes. The couple introduced themselves. They told the little girls that they had some clothes that the girls might like. To retrieve the clothes, Mary and Janice followed the couple into the woods.
Take care of yourself. We're gonna get the man.
Mary was close to death when she managed to drag herself to the street.
I'll show you these photos.
She was able to identify Coleman, but could not identify Brown from photographs sent by the FBI. However, the girl's description matched Brown exactly. Now, investigators were dealing with two killers.
We had looked at Deborah Brown up until that point in time as a witness because she had cooperated with us in Waukegan. She had told us about Alton, telling her that he had done something wrong. She showed us the clothes that he had been wearing the night he had come back, when he'd been out all night and when he came back in the morning. So we had looked at her as a witness. We now knew from the investigation in Gary that she was likely assisting him.
Investigators struggled to figure out some way to predict Coleman and Brown's next move. Both murders occurred in largely black communities, communities where the two could easily blend in. And they were quick to gain people's trust.
These were street people. They had that charm. They didn't have to do any arm twisting. It was always a very easy thing with them.
Searching for anything that might help them locate and stop the killers, investigators consulted an FBI behavioral profiler. For the profiler, the escalating pattern of violence was caused by Coleman's legal problems back in Waukegan.
He saw the fact that he had taken Vernita the night before a court appearance on the rape of a 14-year-old, and that he had abducted her and then murdered her as an indication that he was responding to the stress of the court appearance, and so that he would continue to murder out of anger and stress and rage.
Investigators had reason to fear that the two murders were only the beginning of a ferocious crime spree. To capture a serial killer, the profiler suggested a massive national media campaign aimed at the black communities.
So we started a publicity campaign, releasing his photograph, releasing pictures of Brown to the media, press releases, everything we could to get his picture out in the forefront. Our hope was that somebody would see him and turn him in.
But the task force was always a step behind. On July 8th, agents received information from local Ohio detectives about an elderly woman named Rose Wiggins who reported her daughter missing. Rose explained that earlier in the day she had come by to check on her daughter and found the door locked. Her young grandson, James, was too frightened to open the door. The detective convinced him they were there to help. Now he had nothing to fear. Officers immediately started to search the house for the boy's missing mother. While looking, they found 3-year-old Johnny, afraid like his older brother. Meanwhile, James told the detective about the man and woman who had been at their house.
Well, they were in this house.
He showed the 8-year-old photos of the suspects, Coleman and Brown.
This is the lady, right?
James positively identified them as the couple who were there the night before.
You're absolutely sure? Okay, Regan. I don't. Detective Smith.
Searching the house for the boy's mother, the police found blood smeared throughout the kitchen. It led down to the basement. Not knowing who or what awaited them, the investigators followed the grisly trail. In Ohio, police responding to a missing persons call made an alarming discovery. The young son of the missing mother had identified fugitives Coleman and Brown as having been in their home. Blood stained the walls. They proceeded cautiously, not knowing if their suspects could still be lurking in the darkened basement. The trail stopped, where the bodies of mother and daughter, Virginia and Kimberly Blake, were discovered, shoved into a crawl space beneath their home.
Coleman and Brown. We didn't know where they were, and the violence connected with the murders and the crime scenes was beginning to intensify.
The officers continued their search, still believing their suspects could be somewhere in the family's home. But they seemed to have slipped away, leaving behind unmistakable evidence, clippings of jerry-curled hair. James recounted for investigators that his mother, Virginia, had met Coleman and Brown earlier in the day.
What you guys doing? Fun. Hey, we just moved to the area down the street. What's your name?
The couple stopped by the house and played with the kids.
Yes, we live down the street. We're just riding around.
Virginia invited them to stay for dinner. It was just like any other summer evening in the neighborhood. Virginia cooked while the kids hung around and chatted with their new friends.
Are you going to go into red? You can stay.
8-year-old James saw Coleman take a knife from the counter and slip it into his back pocket.
Soup's on, guys. Soup's on.
After enjoying dinner together, Coleman, Brown, James, and his younger brother settled into the living room to watch television. At the top of the evening news, the story of a pair of killers on the loose flashed across the screen. Coleman immediately turned off the television and shuffled the boys off to bed,
Have a good night.
while Kimberly and Virginia washed the dishes. Aware of the growing media attention, Coleman realized he and Deborah needed to change their look. He found some scissors and cut off his hair. Coleman, with Brown at his side, approached the little girl and her mother. Just upstairs, James and Johnny were asleep.
What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing?
They dragged the slain woman and her daughter downstairs and stuffed them into a crawl space.
The pressure was mounting. It was becoming increasingly stressful because here we were for the 4th time catching up with him when we found more bodies.
Coleman and Brown's MO was designed to catch their victims off guard.
When someone comes up to your house on a bicycle, you figure them to be local. If they're walking, you may be a little bit suspicious. But if they're riding a bike, they're from the neighborhood. Your guard is automatically down.
News of the murdered mother and daughter horrified the community. The savage nature of the killings caused the FBI to add an 11th position on their 10 most wanted fugitives list. It was a rare occurrence. The number 11 ranking was reserved for particularly vicious killers, a description fitting Coleman and Brown.
The magnitude and the importance of it, that you've already got 10 that are bad, but here's one that's so bad, but we don't have room to put anybody else on. We're going to make an exception and put him on anyway, even though he's number 11.
With the national media spotlight focusing on the couple, it would be difficult for them to remain anonymous.
And in solving fugitive cases, finding people, there is nothing better than publicity, because all you need is the one phone call from one person saying, I saw this picture and I know it's this individual.
Phone calls poured in with more frequency and speed than ever before. Any crime that matched their suspect's MO was funneled back to the task force headquarters. Hopefully, they would be able to get one step ahead of the fugitives. Investigators were sure that Coleman and Brown would tire of a life on the run and return to familiar territory. Agents contacted everyone the two associated with in Waukegan.
We would contact them and let them know that we're still looking for them. We would go out and tell them that Alton and Deborah had been involved in another murder case, hoping that that would get them a little bit more on our side.
On July 13th, local investigators responded to a frantic 911 call from a suburb of Cincinnati, Ohio. Michelle Stone told the officers what had happened that day.
They were both young.
A couple arrived at the Stones' house earlier that morning. They told Michelle's father, Jack Stone, that they were interested in buying his camper, which was for sale in the driveway. Jack's wife, Anna, joined them on the porch. As Jack and Anna chatted with them, Michelle left for work.
I won't be long. I'll see you guys later. You'll be home for dinner? Yeah. All right.
Be careful, Mom.
Bye-bye.
I remember I didn't really see them.
When she arrived home later that day, Michelle noticed the bikes the couple had arrived on were still in the yard. And her father's car was missing.
Mom?
Inside, she found her parents' home had been vandalized.
Mom?
She had called out to her mother and father. Hearing no response, her mind began to race as she stepped through the shattered glass and overturned furniture littering the room.
Dad? Mom? Dad?
As she called 911, Michelle could hear a weak voice calling out from another room. Next to the basement door, she noticed a bloody palm print.
Dad? Dad, are you here?
She walked down into the dimly lit room, not knowing what or who she might find. Lying next to each other, motionless on the floor, she discovered her parents. Her father, Jack, was barely alive. As she reached to take her mother's pulse, she lifted the sheet. Her mother, Anna, was dead. Michelle waited by her father's side for help to arrive.
My mom had a sheet over her body.
Her parents had been bludgeoned and bound. Michelle's description of the couple that had stopped by her parents' house earlier that day matched the fugitives, Coleman and Brown. A forensic team went to work collecting evidence. Among the items was a pair of plastic shoes next to Anna Stone. A recent sighting of the suspects included a description of Brown wearing these same shoes. Crime scene technicians also retrieved other bloodied tools found around the body. Later, forensics confirmed the crowbar was used to kill Mrs. Stone. Coleman's prints were all over it. He made no attempt to conceal his crimes. But there was nothing to suggest where the couple had gone.
It was all dead ends. Every time we'd find a body, they were gone. You don't have anything as to which way they're going. You have no indicators as to who their next victim's going to be. Depends. If they wanted sexual gratification, they may snatch a child. If they need a vehicle, they may snatch an adult. Just don't know. We've got a couple of mad dogs out there.
The crime against the Stones showed the couple was able to gain the trust of people from outside the black urban centers where they had found their first 4 victims. This realization only complicated the investigation. Coleman could fit in anywhere.
Or they would come up on a bicycle and start chatting, and he would be looking to play in a card game. Or sometimes they would respond, they wanted to buy something, or they had something for sale. He was an extremely glib person, a real con man. And people trusted him. Plus, he was traveling with a woman. And so people were not nearly as suspect of him as they should have been.
Though Coleman's rage continued to intensify, his ability to charm more victims remained consistent, and he was showing no signs of growing tired of the kill. A month and a half had passed since Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown embarked on a killing spree that had left 5 victims dead. In Cincinnati, Coleman bludgeoned a husband and wife, leaving the wife dead and the husband barely clinging to life. Their car was missing. An APB was immediately put out on the vehicle. Two days later, a farm worker discovered the abandoned car on his property in Lexington, Kentucky, 105 miles away from the crime in Cincinnati. In less than 2 days, the fugitives had traveled hundreds of miles across 2 states. The FBI media blitz was leaving them with few places to hide. But the couple appeared to be heading further away from their home in Illinois, not closer, as investigators had hoped.
When you're talking about Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown, they are not a normal killing machine. A normal killing machine is going to be one person. We've now got 2 out there. They're working together. They're feeding off each other, and one's giving support. Those are the problems. We couldn't separate them. We couldn't talk to one. We couldn't talk to either one of them.
Knowing Coleman would eventually need to steal a car, the FBI saturated the Lexington, Kentucky area. They did not have to wait long for signs that he was still in town. In a hotel parking lot, Professor Oline Carmichael was assaulted and his car stolen. A couple forced him to hand over his cash and car keys. Leaving the professor wounded but still alive, they sped away. After receiving medical attention, police asked Carmichael to look at mugshots that included the FBI's most wanted fugitives. Without hesitating, he pointed to Coleman and Brown.
That's her, without a doubt. Those are the 2.
The FBI were now only a few hours behind the fugitives. An APB was issued for Carmichael's car. In a matter of hours, they received a response. It came from police in an Ohio town close to the Kentucky border. The professor's car was found, abandoned behind some vacant buildings. Coleman and Brown, however, were nowhere in sight. For the experienced agents, finding the car in Ohio meant Coleman and Brown were probably on their way home.
Gut instinct is going to tell you that he's going to come back home. He may not come back to Waukegan, but he's going to come back to some place that he feels comfortable with. He'd never been to Gary, Indiana. He'd never been to Detroit. He had never been to Toledo. Had never been to Cincinnati, Dayton, Ohio, Lexington, Kentucky. At some point, he's going to get tired, and he's going to want to get back to comfort. Some place that he feels comfortable. He knows the streets. He knows the people. He's going to feel comfortable. He's coming back.
The FBI immediately set up a dragnet. Agents and police officers from across several states joined forces to track Coleman and Brown as they headed home to Illinois. Reports of stolen vehicles or assaults were to be given immediate attention. An officer in Dayton, Ohio, responded to a report involving an assault and a stolen car. The call came from an elderly couple, Reverend and Mrs. Gay. Reverend Gay had been badly beaten. Mrs. Gay told the officer that a young couple who they had met weeks earlier broke into their house. After beating them, the attackers demanded the keys to their station wagon. According to the description, the attackers were Coleman and Brown. New leads were coming in at a furious pace. Coleman and Brown were still just out of reach. But the FBI was starting to close the gap. The day after the attack in Ohio, detectives involved in the FBI's dragnet discovered a station wagon that had been abandoned near a car wash in Indiana. It belonged to Reverend Gay. Later in the day, some road crew workers on the edge of Interstate 65 outside of Zionsville, Indiana, made a gruesome discovery. It was the body of an elderly man who had been reported missing from his home in Indiana. He was found on his 77th birthday. Evidence left at the scene was unmistakable. Coleman and Brown had claimed another life. The body was found less than 20 miles from the couple's home turf. The country's most wanted fugitives had come home, and the FBI was waiting for them. For 7 weeks, Coleman and Brown assaulted and killed victims in 6 different states. While investigators worked the crime scenes, scores of local officers and agents organized a dragnet to trap them as they headed back home to Illinois. The aggressive media campaign was having an impact. On July 20th, in Evanston, Illinois, a man spotted Alton Coleman with Deborah Brown in Mason Park. While he waited with the car running, his friend called the police. It was the one phone call investigators had been hoping for.
He went to school with Alton Coleman. He knew without a shadow of a doubt that the man that crossed the street in front of him was Alton Coleman.
Evanston police responded. Only a couple of yards stood between the law and Coleman and Brown. With surprising ease, they were able to corner Coleman. He insisted they had the wrong man. A second pair of officers surrounded Brown. When asked, she gave a different pair of names for herself and Coleman.
What's your name?
Trina Williams.
Having found a knife and a false identification, the officers brought Alton Coleman to the police station.
4 other units be advised when you pick up the female, she might have a weapon in her purse. Make sure you check it. 610-0.
A search of Brown's handbag uncovered a .38 caliber pistol.
523-607. Get us over here. We got
The weapon was all they needed to handcuff her and take her in.
Anything we need to know about? No?
2 of the FBI's most wanted were apprehended without incident. After nearly 2 months, the violent rampage was over. Coleman continued to insist he hadn't been in any of the places where the murders happened. But the forensic evidence collected over the past 7 weeks proved otherwise. Alton Coleman was charged with the federal crime of kidnapping Vernita Wheat, followed by murder charges in 3 other states. Deborah Brown was also charged for her role in the murders. As investigators from the task force looked on, a strip search uncovered a bloody steak knife. It would be linked to yet another murder, a 15-year-old Ohio girl, Alice Myers. Illinois State's Attorney Matthew Chansey was given the task of prosecuting Alton Coleman. In his mind, the motive was simple.
With Vernita Wheat, he crossed a threshold, and once he crossed that threshold, it was easy for him, and I think that he enjoyed it. And it wasn't just easy anymore; it was something he liked. He liked doing, and so he looked for every opportunity he could to repeat that.
Together, Coleman and Brown had stolen 7 lives. 3 states sought to take theirs. Brown stood trial separately. She was sentenced to life in prison. Until the end, she was committed to Coleman.
At Coleman's sentencing hearing for that murder, she testified on his behalf that she had committed the murder and he had not, in an obvious attempt to try to save him. It didn't work.
Coleman and Brown's rampage had covered over 1,300 miles in 6 states. For Special Agent Berdina Passanelli, the intensity of the FBI's hunt prevented more needless murders.
Because of the massive investigation that we did and the publicity that we did, that he was caught within 7 weeks of when he started. Had we not done that, had we not gotten on this right away, who knows how long he would have gone on killing people.
In the end, Alton Coleman was sentenced to death 4 times. He went to prison in Ohio, where he was executed on April 26, 2002. In Miami, a young man is abducted at gunpoint. The kidnappers demand a fortune and threaten to kill. The police and FBI uncover disturbing leads and look for answers in the smallest clues, in a desperate race to find the victim and bring him home to his family.
Kidnapping can shatter a family, bringing terror and heartache without warning. In 1984, with the flash of a gun, an ordinary business transaction became a violent abduction. In seconds, the son of a wealthy Miami developer was gone. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. The kidnappers' motivations seemed to be money, but agents would learn this case and its resolution were more complicated than anyone believed.
Miami, Florida, Tuesday, August 7th, 1984. At 6 o'clock, the sales office of real estate developer Jesus Portela was closing. Mr. Portela had emigrated from Cuba 22 years earlier, building a successful business in Miami. His 22-year-old son, Mario, was recently married and worked as a salesman for his father, as did Mario's uncle. A little after 6, a couple approached the office. Mario and his uncle went out to talk with them. The couple asked about condo prices. The man seemed anxious as they spoke. The uncle explained that the office had closed. He asked them to return in the morning. At the couple's request, he went inside to get some brochures for them. He didn't see what was happening outside. An armed man had pulled up, and the three were abducting Mario. The uncle spotted temporary tags on the car, but only got the last 3 numbers. He told Jesus what he saw. Mario, forced into a blue and gray car, heading north on 122nd Avenue. Then he called the police. But Mario's father couldn't wait for the police to arrive. He went looking for his son. Soon he spotted a car matching the description of the kidnapper's vehicle. For years, he had carried a licensed gun for protection. Now, he was ready to use it. But it was the wrong car. Realizing he couldn't find the kidnappers himself, Jesus returned to wait for the authorities. The Metro-Dade police responded to the kidnapping call. For Detective Alvaro Romero, abductions were not unusual in 1984.
At that time, we were inundated with kidnappings. We had probably 1 kidnapping a month related to narcotics or drug-related kidnappings, where the victims would either be involved in drugs themselves or possibly family members were involved in drug dealings.
But detectives quickly realized Mario's abduction was different.
Questioning Mr. Portela and recognizing the fact that he was a prominent businessman in the community led us to believe that it was not narcotics related and strictly a financial gain for the people who kidnapped his son.
It meant anybody who knew of Mr. Portela's wealth could be a suspect. Hoping the kidnappers left some trace behind, crime scene technicians dusted the door for fingerprints. Mario's uncle believed they might have touched it as they peered inside. No usable prints were found. Less than an hour after the kidnapping, the phone rang.
Hello? See?
Speaking in Spanish, the caller asked for Mario. Mr. Portela didn't recognize the voice.
No. ¿Quién habla?
The caller then announced he was part of a terrorist group that was holding Mario for $3 million in ransom. Although no recording equipment was in place, a Spanish-speaking detective listening in identified the caller's accent as Colombian. The caller threatened to kill Mario if Jesus notified police or the FBI, and warned that the group was watching the Portela house and gave the address. The distraught father pleaded to speak with his son.
Hello?
The kidnapper announced he would call Jesus's home in 3 days.
Hello?
Police could not trace the call, but it helped them understand the type of criminal they were facing.
We felt the kidnappers were very violent. They took precautions as far as the phone calls that they were making, and they were very serious in their threats. They knew what they were doing, and we took them very seriously.
As with any kidnap for ransom, Metro-Dade police called the Miami field office of the FBI for assistance, and the case went to Special Agent John Gill.
The FBI was involved from the very onset. The very fact that a large ransom was demanded caused it to fall into the jurisdiction of what we call the Hobbs Act.
The Hobbs Act makes extortion affecting interstate commerce a federal crime and Mr. Portella's business reached across state lines. Agents from the FBI's reactive squad installed recording equipment on Mr. Portella's office and home phones and arranged to have all incoming calls traced. The next day, Special Agent Gill wanted to talk with Jesus Portella, but not at the trailer or at home. He asked Jesus to meet him at an empty garage. Agents watched the entrances and exits of the garage for any sign of the kidnappers, but did not see anyone. As far as they could tell, it was safe for Gill to question Mr. Portella.
Portella. Yes. My name is John Gill. Your credentials, sir. I have been assigned the administrator of this kidnapping.
The agent asked if Mr. Portella knew of anyone who had a grudge against him, or if he had ever been threatened. The worried father could think of only one minor incident. He said that 8 months earlier, a man and woman burst into his office. He knew the woman. Her name was Rose de Parias. She recently purchased a condominium from him and said she discovered her neighbor's payments were lower than hers. Mr. Portella explained that the difference was because the neighbor had obtained a better finance rate. It was between the buyer and the bank.
The payments were not made to him at all. The financier had paid for the condominium, and he was out of the picture, so to speak.
The two refused to accept the explanation. The man began threatening him, demanding that Portella refund the money. But there was nothing he could do. Before they left, Rose de Parias vowed she would get her money back, one way or another. Mr. Portella had reported the incident to police.
And the police talked to this particular woman and explained to her the circumstances of financing and interest payment, and she apologized, and Mr. Portella just assumed that this had all gone away.
Agents later tracked down Rose de Parias and learned she was living in another state during the kidnapping. When they confirmed her alibi, they ruled her out as a suspect. Investigators were getting worried. With each day that passes, the chances of finding a kidnapping victim alive drastically diminish. They hoped the kidnappers would call again. If they did, the reactive squad was prepared, having wired Jesus Portella's home and office with telephone tap and trace equipment.
Meet at his office, right? All right, I'll be there.
Special Agent Gil Orantia and other investigators needed to be there to monitor the calls and run the equipment. But getting into the home unseen would be tricky.
The initial calls and our indications were that they were watching his home, they being the kidnappers. We were concerned that they might be able to detect that I was coming in.
They needed Mr. Portella's help.
I was crouched in the back seat as we drove to his home. We went into the garage and then we went into the house. We wanted to be able to record the phone calls and be able to capture everything that was said to him regarding any ransom demands.
Agents and Metro-Dade detectives would take shifts, staying with the Portella family 24 hours a day. They briefed Jesus on how to handle the calls. He would be the lead in the effort to get his son back.
One of the things early on, obviously, was to determine if he's even alive or not. And we discussed with Mr. Portella some of the things that he could ask the kidnappers, which only Mario Portella would know, proof of life questions, if you would, that could come back to us to verify, yes, we know he's alive.
In building a profile of Mario, with details about his life, including favorite foods and names of pets, the agents got to know the young man.
Mario Portella was the all-American kid. He had gone to school. He had maintained outstanding grades. He had just gotten married to a young lady, and they were newlyweds with a bright future. Everybody loved him. The reason that this case was so traumatic for so many people is that so many people could identify with them. They were the type of family that we all aspire to be, and they were living the American dream, but they ran into a nightmare.
As promised, the kidnappers called 3 days after the abduction. The caller ordered Mr. Portela to listen to a taped recording. The voice on the tape was Mario. He pleaded with his father to pay the ransom money, warning the kidnappers was serious and would kill him if he called the police or the FBI. Jesus told the caller he had discreetly begun the process of securing the money from his bank. Agents reminded Mr. Portela to ask the proof-of-life questions, including what Mario's nickname was as a child and the name of the dog his wife used to have. The man agreed to call back with the answers. Mr. Portela had kept him on the line long enough for agents to trace the call to a Miami payphone. But the caller had gone before surveillance units arrived. In the harrowing days after the kidnapping, Mr. Portela received several other calls. Speaking in Spanish, a different man talked vaguely and mysteriously of a business proposition apparently unrelated to the abduction.
The demeanor of Mr. Portela at the time was, I really don't have time to talk to you about business because I have other problems. This individual indicated on several calls that he, in fact, was a person that could help solve the problems. His persistence in trying to communicate his involvement in whatever Mr. Portela's problem was caused us to be highly suspicious that somehow he was playing a role or a part in the kidnapping or the ransom demands.
Jesus kept the man on the line, and investigators pinpointed the source of the call. It was coming from the same area as the kidnapper's earlier call. Surveillance units made it to the scene in time to spot the person on the phone. They followed him to a fast food restaurant, where he emerged with a takeout bag. From their biographical profile of Mario, investigators knew the restaurant's burgers were his favorite. They then followed the man to an apartment complex, where his behavior was even more suspicious.
When he took the hamburgers to an apartment and delivered them through the door, having no conversation with the recipient. And this was the brand of hamburgers that Mario and his father fancied. Yes, at that point we were suspicious that perhaps Mario was being held at that location.
The SWAT team responded and set up outside the apartment. The clock was ticking. They needed to find Mario. In Miami, the FBI and Metro-Dade police were trying to find Mario Portela and whoever kidnapped him. Their first good lead brought them to a Miami apartment where they believed the kidnappers might be holding Mario. The SWAT team quickly secured the apartment and searched each of its rooms. But Mario was not there. It had been a false lead for FBI Special Agent John Gill.
It was determined not only by search, but interview of the people there that they were not related or associated with the kidnapping whatsoever.
Interviewing the caller, agents determined he knew nothing of the abduction and was merely trying to get work with Mr. Portela's company. Investigators again were forced to wait for the kidnappers to make the next move. It was the original caller. He answered the proof of life questions correctly, suggesting Mario might still be alive.
That's correct.
And again demanded $3 million. As instructed, Jesus tried to keep the caller on the line. He said he had spoken to the bank and could only come up with 1/3 of the amount. As Mr. Portela negotiated, agents traced the call to another Miami payphone. Units were on their way. Eventually, the caller agreed to $1 million. Trying to stall longer, Mr. Portela said it would take time to get the money since the bank was closed for the night. But the man ordered him to have it ready when he called back in 3 hours with instructions for the drop. Once again, he disappeared before authorities could arrive. Within the hour, Mr. Portela met plainclothes agents at his bank.
Looks like it's all here. You go ahead and sign for it.
There, the FBI recorded the serial numbers of the bills that made up the $1 million ransom, so they could be traced when the kidnappers spent them.
Good. Okay, John? Yes? Thank you. Thank you.
At the Portela home, agents hid a tracking device in the briefcase, hoping it would lead them to wherever Mario was being held. The kidnappers called on schedule and gave Mr. Portela directions for the ransom drop. They ordered him to drive to a local restaurant, leave the car door unlocked with the money inside, wait for a call at a certain payphone, then go into the restaurant and sit down. The caller warned Jesus to go alone. With the loaded briefcases, Jesus began the trip. It took less than half an hour, but to the worried father, it must have seemed an eternity. The restaurant was in a tough and dangerous part of Miami. Undercover agents and Metro-Dade detectives were already there, watching. Agents also manned an empty apartment with a view of the restaurant. Jesus Portela arrived, carrying $1 million in cash and hoping finally to get his son back. But he would soon discover that nothing was as the kidnappers said it would be. Jesus Portela was on his way to deliver $1 million ransom in an unsafe part of Miami, hoping to get his son Mario back. The way he handled the troubling and dangerous situation impressed the investigators working with him, including FBI Special Agent Gil Orantia.
For him to have endured what he did, I have all the respect for him in the world. He performed very, very well. He did the things we asked him to. He did things that probably most of us couldn't do.
The FBI and Metro-Dade police had undercover personnel staking out the restaurant. But the place was closed, and Jesus began to wonder if it was a setup. He found a payphone, though not where the kidnappers said it would be. He was nervous about leaving his car unlocked with $1 million in it. He hoped the kidnappers would call before anything happened to him. If thieves made off with the money, he might never see his son again.
Waiting for a phone call, is that all right? You cut to be around this area. Well, I'm waiting for a phone call. Don't you have something better to do? Keep going on.
Though he waited, the phone call never came. Eventually, Jesus had to leave with the ransom money, but without Mario. He and the investigators spent days waiting for the kidnappers to call again with new instructions.
There were no ransom calls that came after the drop failed. We were concerned at that point because obviously our only connection to them were the phone calls. That was our connection to the bad guys. That was our ability to do something about what they were doing. And when they stopped calling, we became very worried.
Although the kidnappers were not leaving new clues with ransom calls, older clues were beginning to pay off. FBI Special Agent John Hanlon was trying to find the car used in Mario's abduction. It was an older blue and gray four-door Chevrolet sedan and had temporary dealer tags, which were not in DMV databases at the time.
And of course, with a paper tag, it can't be traced, so the car looks perfectly legitimate and doesn't draw the attention of law enforcement.
Hanlon knew used car dealerships sometimes illegally rented cars that were for sale, placing temporary tags on them. He began phoning every dealership in the area. The time-consuming work paid off when Hanlon spoke to a clerk at one dealership in Miami.
I asked her, "You rent any old cars?" And she said, "Sure, you know, and any old with paper tags?" And she said, "Yeah." And I said, "Any old Chevys?" She said, "Yeah." I asked her, I said, "Any blue and gray ones?" She said, "Yeah." I says, "Where is it?" She says, "It's here." And I said, "Well, when was it rented?" And she says, August the 7th. And I'm thinking, oh my God.
August 7th was the day of the kidnapping. When agents discovered the car had been returned the next day, they impounded it to have it searched for evidence. Metro-Dade forensics technicians processed the vehicle. They found no usable hair, fiber, or fingerprint evidence. But they did find a keychain under the back seat. The FBI knew that Mario Portela drove a Volvo.
So we barreled back over there, picked up the keys. We showed them to the family members. Of course, they identified them. It also fit his automobile, and we took it by the house, and the house key fit his home.
It meant that vehicle was most likely used to abduct Mario Portela. Checking records, agents learned a woman named Julita de Parias had rented the car. The clerk at the dealership said the woman came in with a man she said was her brother. Hanlon requested driver's license photos of Julita de Parias and her siblings. 9 days after the abduction, Hanlon met with the clerk who had rented out the car, showing her a photo lineup that included a picture of Julita de Parias, along with several decoy pictures. The clerk identified Julita de Parias immediately.
Are you sure? Positive. Okay, let me ask you, would you look at it? I mean, you have seen this individual before, I'd like you to take a look at it.
The clerk also identified the man who was with her. It was Julita's brother, Julio. Agents were familiar with the De Parias name. They remembered Rose De Parias was the woman who had had the dispute with Mr. Portela the previous year. Julita was Rose's sister. They now believed Julio De Parias was the man who accompanied Rose and threatened Jesus. Although the FBI still ruled out any involvement by Rose De Parias, her siblings were now prime suspects.
Once we had good suspects in this investigation, we put surveillance on some of the members in an attempt to gather more evidence.
The FBI noticed an unidentified man usually accompanied Julita. The couple seemed to be romantically involved. It had been 10 days since the abduction. Agents hoped the suspects would lead them to Mario Portela. They needed to question them. But doing so would alert any accomplices and put Mario's life at risk.
We couldn't exactly jump them at that moment because we were trying to rescue this young man. That was our primary objective, to get this young man back to his family. So we continued to watch them.
The FBI and Metro-Date's surveillance effort included air and ground units. But the suspects seemed to be wary of a tail.
They were very erratic and paranoid in their behavior. Their driving would go in one direction and make a U-turn and go in another direction and then go through a parking lot and then in another direction, which was very taxing on our ability to surveil, in as much as you only have a limited number of automobiles to conduct a surveillance, and when you're passing by the same subject 3 and 4 times in the course of one trip, the chances of being identified as a surveilling vehicle are great.
The suspects' counter-surveillance techniques worked. Following them exhausted the helicopter's fuel supply, forcing agents to turn back. Ground units tried to remain undetected and keep the suspects in sight, but soon they lost them. It was a difficult blow to the investigation. 3 days later, and 25 miles north of Miami, in the town of Davie, Florida, 2 teenagers were walking in a field when they made a grim discovery that would provide terrible answers to a family hoping for the best. 13 days after Mario Portela was kidnapped, teenagers discovered a body in Davie, Florida, 25 miles north of Miami. Davie police realized it was a murder. The man's head was completely wrapped with duct tape. Detective Ed Taylor faced the challenge of identifying the victim.
All we knew at that time was it was a male. We didn't know how old he was because his entire head had been taped. His hands had been taped behind his back and his ankles had been taped together as well. So at the scene, we really didn't have very much information as to the identity of the victim or how old he was or anything of that nature.
They needed to examine the body, tape, and sleeping bag for more clues and remove the evidence to the controlled environment of the lab. Dr. James Ongley, then Associate Medical Examiner for Broward County, performed the autopsy. He removed the duct tape surrounding the head, careful to preserve each tear and section for later analysis by forensics technicians. With the tape off, Dr. Ongley could describe the victim as male, between the ages of 20 and 40, 5 foot 9 inches tall, with brown eyes and brown hair. Although the victim had been severely beaten, the cause of death was asphyxiation. He believed the man had been dead for 24 to 36 hours. To aid in identification, Dr. Ongley photographed the victim for comparison with photos of missing persons. But he knew the pictures would not be accurate representations of the victim. The tightly wrapped duct tape had distorted facial features, and the summer heat caused significant decomposition.
We took fingerprints from the victim so we could submit them to other departments to see if he had ever been arrested before. We did a press release to the various newspapers with a description of the victim and ran a photograph of the victim to see if anyone could identify him.
On August 25th, a Miami newspaper ran an article about the body found in Davie. FBI Special Agent John Gill noted the description loosely matched that of Mario Portela and immediately contacted the Davie Police Department about the abducted man.
We had received prior dental records of Mario Portela from his family dentist, and those records were in evidence at the FBI office in the event that they were needed to identify a victim. Those records were brought to Davie, Florida. I met with Detective Taylor, and we both proceeded then to the Broward County Medical Examiner's office. Dr. Ongley was then capable with his experience to take those dental films or x-rays and compare them to the body and positively identify that body as being our victim, Mario Portela.
For everyone trying to bring Mario home to his family, the news was devastating.
We had to notify the Portela family that the victim had been identified and deceased.
Now agents were investigating a murder. Reviewing the complex case, they outlined their suspects. Julio de Parias, the man who had threatened Jesus Portela the previous year. His sister Julita, whose name appeared on the rental contract for the abduction vehicle. And the man agents believed to be her boyfriend. All three had disappeared. Agents also developed another suspect, Hector de Parias, Julio and Julita's brother. He was close to his siblings and had a criminal record. Now, with no chance of finding Mario alive, the FBI's investigation could be overt. They interviewed the sister of three of the suspects, Rose de Parias, who had threatened Jesus Portela 8 months before the kidnapping. She denied any involvement and offered her full cooperation. She said Julita's boyfriend was Jesse Ramirez, and that if he and the others could not be found in Miami, they most likely went to Los Angeles, where they had friends. Miami agents forwarded the lead to the Los Angeles field office. There, Special Agent Gregory Pack knew they had no time to lose.
It was imperative to find these people as soon as possible because they are dangerous people, and they are people you don't want on the streets in your city or anybody else's city. If they did this once, kidnapped and murdered, what's to say that they wouldn't do it a second time to some other victim?
Special Agent Pack needed to narrow the scope of the search. He knew the suspects were of Colombian descent, and LA's Rampart district had a large Colombian population.
I went out there with these very good photographs, and I went to all the places that you and I would have to go to occasionally in normal course of living. Dry cleaners, restaurants, hotels, motels, apartments. After a couple weeks of this door-to-door canvassing, I ran across a lady who was the apartment manager. I showed her the photographs.
She recognized Hector, Julita, and Julio de Parias as new tenants, but said they seemed to be rarely at home.
So I left my card with her and asked her if she would call me. And I called her at least once a day. This went on for probably 8 or 10 days. Finally, in the evening, about 9 o'clock, I received a call from the office, and this apartment manager was on the line and wanted to be patched through to me. So I accepted the call. And she told me that the people that I had been looking for were in the apartment now. We approached the apartment house, took up various positions so there wouldn't be any escape out the windows or other doors. And as we ran in the front door, there was a gentleman pointing a revolver at us. So we tackled him, wrestled the gun from him, took him into custody, and then there was another person there.
The man with the gun was Julita's boyfriend, Jesse Ramirez. He was held on charges of assaulting a federal officer. The other man in the room was Hector de Parias, Julita and Julio's brother. He was held on a parole violation for drug possession and burglary. 2 suspects were in custody, but 2 were still at large.
We knew Julita and Julio were still outstanding. So when we left, I had 2 agents remain at the apartment. Several hours later, Julita came back.
she was taken into custody, and then she was brought down to FBI headquarters in Los Angeles.
Agents waited for Julio de Parias, but he never showed. The case agent in Miami, John Gill, learned of the arrests.
Gregory Pack, the special agent in the Los Angeles division, called our division here in Miami. I was immediately on an airplane the morning of the telephone call, met with Agent Pack at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon in Los Angeles, where I briefed him on our experience and knowledge of the case.
Jesse Ramirez and Julita de Parias refused to talk to investigators. But Special Agent Gill and Davie, Florida Police Detective Ed Taylor had more success with Hector de Parias. They needed his help to find the fourth suspect, Julio de Parias. And they needed to know the details of Mario Portella's last days. On September 24th, 1984, the FBI apprehended 3 suspects in the kidnapping and murder of Mario Portella. But a fourth suspect, Julio de Parias, was still at large. Only one of the 3 in custody, Hector de Parias, agreed to talk. Still, he was evasive at first, and investigators caught him in several lies. Davie Police Detective Ed Taylor and FBI Special Agent John Gill decided on the soft approach to get the truth.
We befriended him in this style of interrogation, realizing that the potential was there to develop trust and cause him to, in a sense, confess.
So that we know
on the second day of interrogation, he became cooperative to the point that he was right on the edge of divulging his criminality.
Tell me, Hector.
As he became more trustful of Mr. Taylor and I, he advised us that, yes, he would cooperate and divulge details. He was not involved in the abduction, but several days after the abduction, Mario was being held captive in an apartment. The brother, sister, and the sister's paramour discovered that maintaining guard on a kidnapped victim is a lot of trouble, and they needed help. And they knew that Hector was available, that he was unemployed, that he was addicted to marijuana, could not get a job, and in fact would jump at an opportunity to participate in a venture with financial gain. So they solicited his help to watch a victim, as he put it.
According to Hector, the motive for the kidnapping was actually revenge. Julio de Parias felt humiliated that he could not force Mr. Portella to refund his sister's money after she purchased her condominium. Hector said that after several days, his brother Julio and Jesse Ramirez worried about getting caught and gave up on trying for a ransom. They decided they had to get rid of the only link to them, Mario Portella. So on August 17th, 1984, 10 days after the kidnapping, they decided to murder him. Jesse Ramirez began wrapping Mario Portella's head with duct tape as he pleaded for his life and prayed. As Mario struggled to breathe, Jesse beat him with a metal bar. After the murder, Julio de Parias paid Jesse Ramirez $1,000 for the job. Hector claimed to have no idea of Julio's whereabouts, but he did know where Mario was held and murdered.
Hector not only was able to give us an address of an apartment complex and the building unit, Hector was even able to draw us a diagram of the interior of the apartment, where the various rooms were, furniture, where the murder had taken place.
A team of agents, detectives, and forensics technicians rushed to the apartment in Miami. They secured it as a crime scene and processed it for clues. Any evidence recovered might help put Mario's killers behind bars. But seeing it brought back to investigators the disappointment of not being able to save the young man's life. Special Agent Gil Orantia was there.
As we entered this apartment, we saw a roll of duct tape on the side of a nightstand. We saw a bar that we believe was used to strike Mario with. We saw blood in the apartment. We saw all of these things that sort of put this thing, for us, evidentiary-wise, together. But it was a difficult thing to look at. It was a situation where, you know, our goal was to do the right thing and get him saved, and we couldn't do it. And it was tough. It was tough for us to look at that.
In addition to duct tape, investigators found pieces of adhesive medical tape in the room. They also recovered hair and fiber evidence. Everything was cataloged and sent to the FBI lab in Washington, D.C. for analysis. There, Special Agent Hal Dedman of the FBI's Trace Evidence Unit analyzed the items.
My involvement in the case dealt with the comparison of hairs, textile fibers, and tape from the 4 locations: the body recovery site, the apartment where the victim was held, a car that the body was transported in, and another apartment where clothing from one of the suspects was recovered.
He matched carpet fibers from those locations to samples found on the suspects and the victim. He also compared the tape wrapped around the victim's head, arms, and legs to the rolls of tape recovered at the murder scene.
If you have 2 pieces of tape that were once original or adjoining sections of the same piece of tape, and that tape is torn, the yarns are not all going to have the same appearance, they're not going to have the same length. You'll have short pieces and long pieces. And you can fit these pieces of tape together much like you'd fit pieces together in a jigsaw puzzle.
Special Agent Dedman determined the tear on the roll of tape from the apartment was a perfect fit with a piece of tape recovered from the victim's head. He also compared the tears on a strip of medical tape found on suspect Jesse Ramirez's shoes to those on the roll of medical tape found in the apartment and to those on a piece from the victim's body. It was another exact match.
Each piece of evidence contributed, and the result was that there was a tremendously strong association between the suspects in this case and the victim.
Jesse Ramirez and Julita de Parias were found guilty on kidnapping, extortion, and murder charges. Both were sentenced to life in prison. Hector de Parias pleaded guilty to the same charges and received 40 years. But the 4th suspect, Julio de Parias, was still out there.
We believed that he could have fled to Latin America somewhere. So we printed up wanted flyers that you'd find in your post office, in police departments. We sent them all over the place, and we developed the same ones in Spanish, and we distributed them throughout Latin America.
Almost 4 years after the kidnapping, in November of 1988, the FBI learned Costa Rican customs officials were holding a man who resembled the photo of Julio de Parias in the FBI's wanted poster. Special Agent Orantia flew to Costa Rica. The man did look like the photo, but it was his voice, the one from the ransom calls, that tipped Orantia off.
I had listened to those phone calls over and over and over again, hundreds of times. I knew that voice. That voice was a part of me as much as anything's a part of me. So at the moment he opened his mouth, that was it. That was it. It cinched it. I knew it was him.
The federal trial of Julio de Parias began 5 years to the day after Mario Portella's abduction. He was convicted of kidnapping, extortion, and murder, and sentenced to life. For the FBI agents who had gotten to know the victim's family, the convictions were important, but not the ending they had expected.
This was a horrendous crime. For some type of justice not to come out of it would have been difficult for the community in Miami and for the family, and I'll be honest with you, for us too, the agents. So I think the idea that some type of justice occurred is paramount. That's the only thing we can cling to, all of us, that at least they were caught.
The Portela family has persevered. They will never forget Mario, and they have not given up their dream.